This is Ancient History, Book 1, Lesson 4. Start off with the vocabulary. Make sure you familiarize yourself with these words. Chances are you haven't seen many of them before. Move on to the speculation section and answer those questions. And so we're going to go ahead and get started with migration. So, this is where things get really interesting when it comes to the constantly updating nature of delineating history. When we research information about how sapiens migrated to America, things get complicated rather quickly. 30,000 BCE. The most accepted theory for a long time was the land bridge theory, also known as the Bering Land Bridge. The main idea of this theory is that around 30,000 BCE, sea levels dropped during the ongoing Ice Age, revealing land that connected South Siberia to Alaska and North Canada. The people who eventually became America's indigenous population supposedly began migrating across the bridge by 16,500 BCE and made it south of the Canadian ice sheets by 15,000 BCE. However, this is far from certain, as newer evidence shows that this path to the Americas may not have been as viable as we once believed. Ask Willerslev, an evolutionary geneticist who led the first successful sequencing of ancient DNA, and his colleagues have published a series of studies that have fundamentally changed how we think about human history. The researchers studied the pollen, macrofossils, and DNA from lake sediments found within the Peace River Basin, an important section of the proposed migration path over the Bering Land Bridge. The research results found in the corridor's choke point was not biologically viable enough to have sustained humans on the arduous journey until 12,600 years ago, centuries after people were known to have been in North America. Willerslev's team found that until that time, the bottleneck area lacked the basic necessities for survival, such as wood for fuel and tools or game animals to be killed for sustenance by hunter-gatherers. This shows that while the land bridge existed at some point, it would not have been a feasible pathway for the first people who migrated to the continent. In fact, anthropological geneticist Jennifer Raff has compiled information showing America having been inhabited much longer than scientists have presumed for the last several centuries. Her book, Origin: A Genetic History of the Americas, shows well-dated archaeological sites, including recently announced 22,000-year-old human footprints from White Sands, New Mexico, are at odds with the Clovis first hypothesis. We'll talk more about that later. Raff uses archaeological and genetic evidence to argue that the path prehistoric humans used to teach the Americas was coastal instead of on land, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. She goes on to argue that Beringia was not a bridge, rather a sizable settlement region used for millennia by ancestors of indigenous Americans. So, now we've introduced a new term, the Kelp Highway hypothesis. The article, The Kelp Highway Hypothesis, Marine Ecology, the Coastal Migration Theory, and the Peopling of the Americas, in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, discusses several of the earliest archaeological sites which are on islands and along the coastline near resource-rich kelp forests. The animal remains found on these sites are shellfish, fish, and sea mammals, which reinforces the idea that people were using the kelp forest to forage for food. Between 18,000 and 13,000 years ago, a linear band of productive kelp forests may have extended from Japan to Baja California, providing a kelp highway to facilitate maritime peoples' migration into the New World. This theory, as well as other land bridge alternative theories, are all far from being proven, which simply goes to show that we still don't know everything about human history, even when it comes to the things we thought we've known since the 1800s. 30,000 BCE. In entirely unrelated news, people from Zhoushan, Liaoning province in China were making sewing needles from bone. We know this feels anticlimactic, especially since we've already discussed the invention of sewing needles literally tens of thousands of years earlier. But trust us, this is important. This is a sign that we are approaching the Mesolithic period, even as early as 30,000 BCE, when that period of the Stone Age won't officially start for another 20,000 years. The Mesolithic period was a time of cultural development and diversification, so the evidence of upgraded versions of a tool specialized to a certain region shows development in this direction. These needles were used primarily to make warm garments. This, combined with the waves of large migrations to other regions of the world, just goes to show how sick people were of being cold or dying from extremely low temperatures. We were in an ice age after all. 28,000 BCE. Continuing with the trend of early advancements in what is now the modern-day Czech Republic, we have found the earliest recorded evidence of clay being used to make stuff. At Dolní Věstonice, a prominent archaeological site, figurines made of clay mixed with crushed mammoth bone have been uncovered. These figurines were made and fired as a form of artistic expression. See, we're still finding uses for fires. This is interesting because not only does it say a lot about human mental development, it also means that people are beginning to have time for artistic expression. It must have been a nice change to be able to divert energy from basic survival to cathartic hobbies. 25,000 BCE. Fertility seems to be important to the people of this time period. In the remains of the campsite Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France, early clay sculptures depicting pregnant women were found. Halassar, a prehistoric town in Turkey, had depictions of women as goddesses. The cave site, Çatalhöyük, had images suggesting that oracles or cult priestesses were being venerated at the time. These early artistic depictions of women were dominated by full-figured forms. What is most interesting about these figurines is that they were all tiny. By all indications, they were meant to be worn. This signifies some kind of veneration or possible worship status. Meanwhile, in Spain, paintings were found from two periods of human occupation at the Altamira cave site. People from the Gravitan group, who inhabited large areas across Europe, lived in this cave from 25,000 to 20,000 BCE, and the people from Middle Magdalenian, living in Central Europe and northern Spain, inhabited from 15,000 to 10,000 BCE. Numerous archaeological remains were left behind by these groups. 17,000 BCE. In 17,000 BCE, weaponry was becoming more advanced in France. The invention of the atlatl, a simple tool that assisted in launching spears by hand, was pretty impressive. This tool basically used leverage to gain velocity when throwing darts or spears, sort of like how you use a lacrosse stick to throw balls faster and faster, except it's much smaller, made of wood or bone with a hook, and launches a spear, which is much cooler. 15,000 BCE. Sticking to France, the Lascaux cave has about 600 paintings and around 1,500 engravings from human occupation. Like many other caves, archaeologists believe that it was a center for hunting and religious rites. Like a prehistoric town square or community center, people gathered here for community activities such as food processing, eating, and religious practices. A different cave site in America, located in modern-day Austin, Texas, is called Buttermilk Creek. which is a very Southern American name for a place. This site was found fairly recently in 2006 and dates back to 15,000 BCE. It was originally labeled as one of the Clovis sites, which will come up a couple of times in upcoming lessons. An odd thing that happened with multiple cave sites, including ones we've mentioned earlier, is that for a while, tourists and the general populace were allowed to just play around in caves as if they weren't important archaeological findings. This was usually done for educational purposes after scientists thought they'd found all they were going to be able to find, which is good, but damaging to the historical conservation, which is not so great. In fact, the Buttermilk Creek site was a pay-to-dig attraction for a period of time. This one, like many others, was eventually closed to the public and became solely accessible to academic researchers. In this case, this was especially good because it resulted in archaeologists finding a literal trove of pre-Clovis artifacts, which ended up reshaping the way American archaeologists approached the digs. They actively contradicted the Clovis first model of archaeology, which, again, we'll be addressing in later lessons. Similarly, the Monte Verde site in modern-day Chile is a very important discovery in the Americas. The site was found in 1975 by locals after discovering large animal bones uncovered by erosion of the creek's bank. During excavation, they discovered a good number of extremely well-preserved pre-Clovis artifacts, including food scraps from megafauna and wads of masticated seaweed, likely chewed for medicinal purposes. In less groundbreaking but equally exciting news, around the same time people were beginning to domesticate animals, especially wolves. That's right, everybody. Dogs are just over the horizon. Dogs, dogs, dogs. Everything else that has happened in this lesson is interesting, but the promise of dogs is objectively our favorite, other than the spear launches. Those are also pretty great. 14,500 BCE. In Japan, we are now developing a very distinctive method of pottery decoration. Beginning in the Jomon period, from 14,500 to 300 BCE, the Japanese were making vessels with rope designs and details. The word Jomon means cord pattern, thus the name. At this point, the population still wasn't practicing agriculture. Clay pots and vessels were being used to prepare food, so they were not quite decorative yet, although decoration was starting to be added. 14,500 BCE. This is the beginning of the end of an era, literally. While both the Paleolithic period and the Ice Age were beginning to wind down, this is far from the actual end of the Stone Age. As we discussed earlier, the Paleolithic period was followed by two more periods before we reached the beginning of the Middle Ages. However, we have reached the end of the period ruled by periods of glaciation. The end of the Ice Age signals the beginning of a different way of life for human populations. Imagine the burden of strangely fluctuating warm and cold patterns suddenly lifting and leaving you with more predictable weather patterns. You now have the luxury of being able to plan for not only the next 10 years, but larger chunks of you and your children's lives. It changes everything. So that was a historical text from Book 1, Chapter 4. There's some literature to explore in this chapter, including origin stories such as the Book of Genesis. We talk about reading Gilgamesh here. And yeah, don't forget to look at the contemplation questions and answer those at the end of the chapter. Until next time.